To the Provo Orem Municipal Council joint meeting. We're gathered in the City Center Conference Room at 321 West Center in Provo, and it is 12:10 p.m. We welcome the Orem City Council and support staff. Appreciate them being here, and our mayors and administration. Appreciate you being here. Yeah. We also have Dr. Larry Walters here to answer some questions in regards to our property tax exemption that we'll be hearing from actually Cameron Deal from the Cities of Town to be here to discuss some of these items later on our agenda. But we welcome all of you and jump ahead and lead Isn't from Tribune. So appreciate you being here. Thank you. We will begin with a roll call. We'd actually have, if we have everybody participate in the roll call, that would be appreciated. We'll start with Mr. Winterton.
Take a big bite. Gary Winterton, Wayne Parker, Dave Connect, Sam Litz, John Bruce, Richard Bruce,
Kim Santiago,
Dave Sewell, Cliff Strachan,
Mark C. Strand, Brent Sumner,
Debbie LeRae,
David Hardy,
Tom McDonald,
Karen Tapahi,
Bryce Mumford,
Jamie Davison, Stephen Downs, Brandon Mighty,
Thank you. We'll begin with an opening prayer, and Mark C. Strand is coming up to do that. Thank you.
Our Father in heaven, we are grateful for this chance we have to get together as the leadership of two great communities. We're grateful for the beauty that surrounds us, for the wonderful people that live in our communities, for the many blessings that we enjoy here. Help us to be able to work well together, to be able to identify opportunities to collaborate and to find ways to improve the quality of life for our communities as best we can. Grateful for the chance we have to work together and for the many blessings we've been given. And this we pray for. And thank thee for the food. Bless it that it'll strengthen and nourish our bodies into this good that we need. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Amen.
So the first item on the agenda is an update on the DRT referendum. And I'm actually not sure if this came from Provo City or Orem City, but happy to give an update on that anyway. I'm trying to go into the meeting.
Let me go check on.
Our legal counsel. Anyway, my understanding is that the city has it's actually doing it from what your city is doing that with the DRT referendum.
Well, sure. The people running the referendum have taken it to the Supreme Court. Both Provo and Orem have rejected the referendum as being on items that are not referable. So those people have hired an attorney and submitted it to the state Supreme Court. Both cities have given a response to that. We feel like that in the response it states that the interlocal government law code of the state of Utah states that that's a non-referable item. So that we believe negates that. The lease is a small area of land, and we believe that's an administrative function rather than a policy-making function. In the law, it talks about whether it's policy-making or policy enforcing and carrying it out. And we feel like that because this is not making new policies, that it is in fact not a referable item. Of course, we as the mayors, both in Provo and in Orem, have the right to go ahead and sign contracts for the city. And so we have the right to actually sign those documents without the approval of the city council, at least in Orem. Even though we did that so that it's transparent, people know what we're doing, and we have to support the city council. So we believe that those items should be thrown out by the Supreme Court. It's my understanding that usually takes 3 to 6 months. It could take 9 months. So we believe that the project's moving forward. And I don't know how far you want me to go into what's occurring or not, but
what's occurring and
with the project itself.
yeah, I'm in Provo, like we're already on University Parkway and 700
Yes.
North. There are already some preliminary, actually, yeah, they're moving dirt.
So we have the first letter of non-prejudice. UTA has put forward $23 million of funding. We're moving ahead with the utilities. We're waiting for the second letter of non-prejudice from the Federal Transit Administration, which will allow us to get into paving work yet this season. And also, at this point, we are waiting for the small starts grant to be appropriated. There's $75 million coming from the federal government. We have received $4 million from the previous grant for this project. $71 million is coming from the small starts grant, and we believe that should come in before Thanksgiving. At which time, if that occurs, then the bond will be carried out and put forth by the county and move forward. So they're on track with the schedule to put this forward. All the buses have been ordered, and we're on track to complete this in the first quarter of 2018.
So can you explain for the public benefit, the ruling of prejudice for the money that's
So
already forward?
a ruling of no prejudice means that when the small start grant comes in, that the work that we have done previous to that, there's no prejudice in paying for that work already. So we're allowed to actually start that work before the small start grant comes in, and they have that in sections. So they have a section for utilities, a section for the bus barn, a section for paving. And that allows us to move forward before the small starts grant money is received. That's what we mean by no prejudice.
What happened is it's going to be the first one Thanksgiving. My opinion, I guess, is how why it's kind of like communities coming over immediately. Thanksgiving.
I was in that meeting. I don't remember it quite that way. I mean, the funds were put forward by UTA. When you're working with the Federal Transportation Administration, there's a lot of things that they actually require that go back and forth and back and forth. They send letters and say, would you clarify this? Would you go over this? So that's the reason for it happening.
Not surprising it's Thanksgiving.
No, it's not surprising at all. This is just the normal give and take of how that works. So it's not a delay due to anything.
So, because we have different forms of government, you were saying that in Orem, you don't need the council's approval to sign the lease agreement. But I just wonder if that translates to Provo, where the council authorized the mayor to sign this or that.
You don't have to ask them to approve.
So, Brian, do you have a question?
We just signed a resolution that gave the mayor the right to sign those.
That's required in Provo.
It is required for Provo. We did two agreements. One was the interlocal agreement that allowed him to put our city into that interlocal agreement where we would have a say moving forward on the project. And that's that group of Orem City, Provo City, the county, NAG, and UTA in a partnership moving forward, being able to work together on how this goes forward. And then there's the other agreement, which was for the lease of the roads to be able to put in the improvements, the enhancements actually on the road. And that agreement, so both agreements for Provo City Council approved the mayor to sign into all those agreements.
Kim, one thing I might mention, those two agreements, the interlocal sets up a operating committee and an executive committee. This is rather unusual in the fact that we have all the parties sit at the table every 1 to 2 weeks and go over what's occurring. And that's a great working relationship that has been very, very helpful in moving this project along. At the same time, the lease allows us the right to tell UTA what we want in the way of landscaping, how we want things to occur, where we actually have say in the matter. And so both of those agreements are excellent. The project can move forward without either one of them, but they are really beneficial to the project and a great help. So we're happy that Provo has authorized the mayor, and we have done the same, and I think it's beneficial for the citizens of both cities to have those in place.
Mr. Davidson?
Mayor Brooks, if I may too, I think there is a requirement, my understanding is to state law and to requiring the approval of the city council for an interlocal agreement. As it relates to the lease, the nature of the lease that the city of Orem has with UTA is significantly different than the nature than the lease that the city of Provo has, not based on the need for the lease, but rather the amount. We have we have a stretch of 200 linear feet that needs to be acquired. It's a very, very small lease amount, and that amount and the value of that lease is significantly less than Provo, and therefore it fit under a threshold that authorization from the city manager would be sufficient to execute that lease. Rather, if, for example, the agreement was to the same amount and the same distance as the city of Provo, it might trigger additional requirements on the part of the city. So there is obviously some subtle differences between the lease requirements in both.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments regarding this topic?
Do we know anything more about the timing, what kind of turnaround time we're gonna get on our response?
We don't, so, and I don't believe that there'll be any indications other than it'll happen when it happens.
Okay.
So, one thing I did want to mention is, as Kim brought up, construction is moving forward on the diagonal. We've noticed on both sides of the road, they've been clearing the road, they are doing the utility work. We're trying to still get part of the paving season this year, which would save us a couple $1 million if we do so. Anyway, I think things are progressing well.
Thank you. So the next item of business is a discussion on the 820 North Corridor study. I believe this was a question that came from the city.
Just wondering what's occurring on your side as far as another freeway exit. Are you actively pursuing it? Are you discussing it?
Part of a discussion, I think, of what this corridor could be. Did you want to explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, the intent, the study really began with our need to replace the bridge on 820 North over the Provo River. And the question was raised, why do we make it? And so we approached UDOT and said, or MAG, and said, we'd love to have a discussion about the future of this corridor before we make a significant decision in terms of the design of the new bridge. And so they agreed to work with us and do a corridor analysis all the way from, from west of Geneva Road to 700 East, where the 800 North Corridor kind of concludes. And so we've looked at the whole corridor. Obviously, there's been a lot of focus on the idea of a freeway interchange, but that's a relatively minor part of the whole corridor discussion. It's really designed to look at with the expansion of the hospital, with continued growth at BYU, what does that mean for this corridor over the long term? And so there were a number of scenarios shared. Different street profiles were looked at, and 3 different alternatives for how a future interchange at 800 North, 820 North might be structured and designed. But at the end of the day, there was never a real initiative on the part of the city or others to have a detailed discussion about an interchange. It was more a factor of how do we plan this corridor long term, and if we're going to build a bridge over the river, how wide should we make it? So we won't have to build it a second time in 15 years when growth continues to occur. So again, it's been characterized as an effort to get an interchange, and that's not been how it is.
So are you looking at building a bridge in the near future, or?
Yeah, we've got a project on the STIP, MAG's short-term transportation improvement plan that would replace the bridge. And so we were just getting into preliminary design and didn't quite know how to answer the question about how wide it would be. So again, we think we now have answered a number of questions about the corridor. And obviously, a lot depends. The width of the corridor depends on if there's an interchange or not. But it's obviously UDOT's call, so this study's given them some data on which to begin their planning process and trying to define if that's in the long-range plan or not. So that's what the study was about.
How does it affect all?
Doesn't, we just like to see what's happening and
Well, clearly,
How that
Actually, it does.
Councilman, there is one, because right now, residents in that area will either go to Center Street to the south or University Parkway to the north, get on the freeway. And so a new interchange or some other mechanism for getting cars on and off the freeway between University Parkway and Center Street clearly impacts the flow of University Parkway, it impacts traffic through the neighborhood, Orem's Main Street and Sand Hill Road. And so there are impacts clearly if there was an additional freeway access that have to be taken into consideration.
I think one of the drivers on that is the University Parkway interchange is under a lot of pressure. And the result being is, what alternatives do we have to look at that?
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Are there any questions? Comments? Next item is an update on Provo's experience with Google Fiber. Mayor, do you want to have this one?
Yes, I'm smiling. The Google open house yesterday where they opened officially up consultancy. The consultancy market. We've been very pleased with the relationship until it was almost simply service in our community, offering change many providers and what they offer, and also what they offer. But also bring a pretty amazing community on the digital divide question and are working hard in many ways and doing a lot of good things in that area as well for schools. It's hard to say, you asked the question how it's impacted the economy, and like so many things, this is one factor of many, and so I don't know if I can tell you specifically, but I can tell you, although it's very nice for an individual to wake up in the morning and do your emails with a gig of speed, that's only nice and not necessary, but for our small businesses, it's really very credible. For small business to have access to that gig speed is really incredible, and it's been well received by them.
Can I make a comment? It also made a huge difference in the city's requirements for ordering the infrastructure. Before, I had done some analysis that was we're going to order millions of dollars a year. The city capital under the city. People thought that we had to pay the bond off, but that's the only obligation we have. Very courteous for the fantastic job of negotiating. Citizens to pay for that bond. So like utility bill, there are hardly any complaints about it.
so you mean you're gonna lose millions of dollars in the future?
Trying to run it.
In
In addition to the bond payment.
In addition to the bond.
Bond payment pays for the past debt, and you're talking
The
about.
ongoing future of the project was at least $2 billion. And also, that's allowed for that.
It's a $3 charge, a telecom charge.
560.
560 back. It's a non.
Transportation.
I'll see what happens when the state, it's what the performance was led by the city. It was going to be retail and wholesale. It was changed to be wholesale only before it was changed. It's not by the council, by grant. Sure. So, it was enough revenue coming in because of the cost. It was a huge blessing in my mind, it was this.
Yeah, so not only do we avoid their costs,
How much money did they spend on the upgrade?
well, they But you can estimate what it would cost to upgrade it. It's clearly over. It's in the $15 million type of investment. Then we were not connected from the roads to the house. Wayne, I think in a third of the cases, we were not connected and then made that connection. Which was substantial. That's $50,000 homes, and that was costing, the city's cost on that was
So are all of the homes connected directly, whether they use it or not, or only
They all
those?
had that option. Google didn't tell us the exact numbers, it's very, very high. But they all had that option for a period of time. Now they'll connect them. I think it's reasonable now to be connected outside that window.
Have we heard any more about cost after 7 years? We haven't talked about it, we're about halfway through that now, and
Yeah, it's hard to believe we're halfway through that. Google's philosophy is that it's like access to the internet is like air and water, that everybody should have it. And when we asked them about extending that past 7 years, they reminded us that they were a company, a very, very young company, and 7 years seemed like a very, very long time to them. And they just didn't know what the world was going to look like in 7 years, so they were hesitant to do it beyond 7 years. But their core philosophy is that everybody should have internet, and that's so we're hopeful that the raise of costs will be very low and possibly no cost.
They just recently have a new option for 100 megs. But I think it's $50. So that's just a cost structure that's a recent change.
Yeah, it's interesting that you go all the way down from 3 or 4 or 5 megs up to 1,000 megs. It's like say I love to let you know with 1,000 megs, but most of our computers restrict us far more than the speed restricts us. So 100 megs for a lot of people will be adequate.
It's amazing how fast that's changing. Just a few years ago, 30 up and down was way more.
But the innovation and technology that's developing is pretty significant in the amount of data usage. That in 5 years, the gig might be too small.
was Salt Lake?
Right, so that's another reason we don't want to know. Because that's whatever that big figure was, it took upgrade to a gig. Somebody could have come in and upgraded to 10 gigs.
Yeah, the rest of us offering 10 gigs.
With their open house in Salt Lake yesterday, did they talk about free internet to the residents there as well? You know, is that a 7-year type deal that they did with them?
They can go into specifics, I'm not sure what they're offering.
Yeah, okay. Just curious.
I think it's also interesting to note that they had projects scheduled for, I think, like San Jose and I think 2 other places where they were going to lay fiber, and they've put that on pause. I think they're now exploring some wireless technology in order to get high speed out to more homes at a lower cost. So it is interesting to see how their business model may be changing to try to, now that they're learning from Kansas City and Provo and Austin and some other places, that they may tweak their model.
I think that plays in very heavily to the fact that 7 years is a lifetime.
Right.
And so making investments in fiber is very long.
It's very price competitive because I pay $130 a month for my video and my internet. My son in the suburb of Austin, which the suburb doesn't have what Austin has. And he said he couldn't get that for $200 a month. What I get, he said, you're just really fortunate to get that kind of speed, the price that you're paying.
Any other questions or comments? Any movement in Orem with,
Still working on it.
yeah. Okay, so, Henry Deal will be here at 1 o'clock to discuss some of these things, but we'll have, we'll put Dr. Larry Walters on the spot and have him discuss our, in our budget committee, council put together a budget committee, and Dr. Larry Walters is our resident expert. He teaches or taught at BYU the Masters of Public Administration program, and he travels the world working for the UN in regards to municipal budgets and tax resource. But we had some ideas, and we wanted to explore those, and then also have Cameron Deal from the League of Cities and Towns come and speak to this issue as well. So, Mr. Dr. Walters.
Thank you. This is an unexpected pleasure. I hadn't anticipated meeting was taking place. The issue that I'd like to bring to your attention and get your thinking about, I recognize that it's not within the purview of the city council at this point, but that's the residential exemption for property tax, which is 45%. And to highlight the issue, let me give you just two examples. Consider a $200,000 house. So the taxable value, if the market value is $200,000, the taxable value, taking off the 45%, would be $110,000. If there's a 1% tax rate, the tax bill would be $1,100. And the value of the exemption then, in terms of taxes foregone, would be $900. Now consider a $2 million house. The taxable value, the same 45% exemption applies, so the taxable value would be $1,110,000. Same tax rate at 1% would generate a tax bill of $11,000. So the value of the exemption for that home is $9,000. $900 compared to $9,000. I think the intent of the exemption is to provide some relief to homeowners. And that, I think that's a very valid effort. It's common in about 38 states across the country. What's uncommon is the fact that the amount of the relief is not capped in some way. And so the bulk of the dollars of relief go to people who have relatively expensive homes. And what I would suggest that if you look at a state like Idaho, for example, they also give a 50% reduction in the assessed value, but they cap it at about $85,000. If we capped it at $90,000, then that $200,000 home would still see exactly the same tax bill of $1,100. The tax bill on the $2 million home would now go to $19,100. So they would also get $900 in relief, but their tax bill would be significantly higher because they have the more valuable property. And so there's nothing magical about $90,000, but I think that it's time for the state to consider a discussion about, is that 45% the right number? That's the maximum allowed under the Constitution. Historically, it was initially set at a much lower level, down in the 20%, and then over a period of years, the legislature adjusted it up and then down a little bit, and finally settled on the max of 45,000. So I think it could be, is that the right percentage? And then should the total amount of the exemption be capped in some way? Please.
So what qualifies you for the exemption? Isn't there a dollar amount of income and an age?
No, sir. It's purely a question of whether it can be considered a primary residence.
Or a residence. Any resident, apartment gets this.
Well, but if you have
Yeah.
that's a separate exemption or a separate credit that can be given. But if you have a second home in Park City or some other county, you're going to pay 100% of the value on that. It's only if it's considered a primary residence for somebody. If it's an apartment building, as indicated, they don't have to own the home, but it's a primary residence for some family, and so they get the exemption. That's the only qualification. Please.
The way you stated that, I'm just trying to understand, was your proposal 100% up to 90,000 or?
No, what I'm saying is keep it at 45% if that's the will of the legislature and the communities, but cap it at some level. Now, we could also consider adjusting it from 45% down to 40 or 35%, something of that sort, which would also then increase the taxes for people at the low income level. But if we left it at 45%, about half the homes would see no change in their tax bill. The other half would see an increase, and depending on how large the increase is, would depend upon how valuable the home is.
So your proposal would be 45, what you just kind of, your example was 45% up to 200,000?
45% up to, yes, up to 200,000. So that the value of the exemption does not exceed $90,000.
It could be up to 300,000, I mean, it could be up to whatever.
Yeah, well, you could set it wherever you felt appropriate.
So what's the average home price? It's above 200,000, right?
That depends on the community. In the urban areas of the state, yes, it's well above that, but in our rural communities, no, it's significantly below that. So this is really a proposal that's going to affect the urban communities along the Wasatch Front and to some extent down in Washington County. It's not going to affect Beaver County very much.
Larry, how much would that raise for the schools, for example?
Well, right now, the total value of the exemption for just the schools is about $600 million a year, which is a significant amount of money for schools. Then if you were to leave the exemption in place but cap it, I'm still working through that, and I'm actually doing that analysis for the state, and we're still figuring out what the totals would look like. Please.
Is that set at the state level? Is that binding for all of the taxing entities? In other
It
words,
is.
If a city wanted to set a cap just for their portion of tax, they couldn't do that without.
That's correct. That's state law. Yes, sir.
So I read in the paper a little while back that Utah has the largest amount of what they call mansions of any state in the nation, and it's relating to square footage. And I think that's actually relating to the fact that we have larger families. Okay. And so when I look at this, I understand where you're going, but personally, I would be against it. I think that the tax relief ought to be, the exemption ought to be the same for whatever price home up and down, because we do have large families, and I think to raise their taxes exponentially would be very tough on them.
The question was,
I'm not talking 2 million, but I am talking larger ones.
But you could go, for example, up to $400,000.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to imagine that $1 million home needs for 45% exemption.
I would keep it the same.
Even if it was, say it was kept at 200,000, someone that in a $400,000 home, it wouldn't be 45% increase, or I guess it'd be close to 100% increase, because they would still have that exemption up to that 200. So it wouldn't be going from 45% to 100%. It'd be going from 45% to 70 or so percent.
Has anyone experimented with a graduated model where they have multiple cutoffs and then multiple rates?
I'm not aware of any. That gets pretty complicated for assessors. But there are a number of states that do grant a residential exemption and then cap it at some point. Sometimes the cap applies only for schools. In other cases, it's just capped generally. Jamie?
I guess one of the questions I have is, I think it addresses a specific, I guess you could say, inequity or challenge with the property tax system, but there still is a vast amount in this county and within our respective cities of tax exempt properties that draw and take advantage of our services, yet do not necessarily pay the services in the same way a commercial business or residential owner would pay for. So, are there alternatives? Are there opportunities for us to have a conversation with our tax exempt partners to say, look, you need to help in the operation of our respective communities? At the same time, I would imagine there would be some, when they hear a proposal like this, who would suggest, well, this is just a taxing jurisdiction's way of working around the state's truth in taxation process. How might you respond to that in a way that suggests, no, it's not, it's correcting a structural deficiency in our system?
I heard two questions there, one about the nonprofits and one about the taxation. Let me answer the second one first, if I could. My suggestion would be that if the legislature makes a change in this assessment ratio, that they suspend truth in taxation for 1 year, and then afterwards it would continue, it would come back into play. I think the Truth in Taxation has been successful at keeping property tax rates relatively low in the state without the draconian measures that have been taken in so many other states that absolutely prohibit local governments from any kind of flexibility in meeting their needs. So I'm in that sense, I'd like to say, let's get rid of truth in taxation, but I think the reality is it's been relatively effective and it's much better than some of the options.
And I would assert that it has been so effective in Orem that the last time we've done it is 1978.
It can't be, because truth in taxation didn't come into place till 1986.
I recognize that. And I think there are other communities who, regardless of whether the recommended increase is $2 or $20, the firestorm that results is counterproductive to municipalities who say it's not worth the brain damage to go through this process.
And if that's the case, then if this kind of a change were put in place, the local government always has the option of lowering the rate. You don't have to keep the same rate. You could lower the rate too, if there's that much concern. But I think that it addresses some equity issues about who's bearing the burden of the cost of the property tax. Let me go back to your first question, though, about the nonprofits. There are a number of communities across the country. Admittedly, most of them are in the upper northeast corner of the country in terms of, not just the New England, but eastern part of the country, that have been successful in negotiating what are known as payments in lieu of taxes with those nonprofit entities. That does take some negotiating, and obviously those nonprofit entities are not excited about it. But if the alternative is, okay, we'll just take your tax exemption for property tax, then they're much more cooperative. In some cases, like in Connecticut, for example, the law actually provides that the state will reimburse cities for those nonprofit entities. That hasn't worked out terribly well because the state legislature runs into budget problems and doesn't always appropriate all the money that they need to actually hold those local governments harmless. But I do think that it's quite appropriate for universities and hospitals in particular, for Ed and Med it's called, to negotiate with those large entities some payment in lieu of taxes. But that happens to on a case-by-case basis. Please.
So recognizing that whether it's the break starts at 100 or 200 or 400 or whatever, that's arbitrary. The legislature has had some struggles over the years. They've wrestled with the question of the disparity between relative values of housing and its impact on property taxes. For example, Park City tends to, in Summit County, raises an awful lot of money for very, very low rates because of the high values of their homes. How would your proposal affect that? I mean, Provo's got a wide disparity between starter homes and end home, or wealthy homes. But some cities are much narrower in that range and at a higher range. How would you address that?
This proposal would not address that issue at all. If there's some concern in that, there would be some possibility, taking a very different approach, think about some regional revenue sharing. I'm not necessarily in favor of that, but I recognize that it's a problem for some communities. Yes, sir.
I'll go next. Go ahead. With the truth in taxation, with the rates, they're adjusted every year in order to keep the revenue the same, except for growth. So it seems like one way to approach that would be to automatically adjust the rates so that it's revenue neutral. And then if cities want to, move it from where it's automatically set, then they would have to go through a truth in taxation.
The difficulty with that is if it's revenue neutral, it would represent a significant tax shift from the business community to the residential community. And as long as, because it essentially would mean lowering rates.
Right.
And so the business community would be the largest beneficiaries in that regard. Please.
I can see where this maybe more fairly taxes the perceived ability to pay, but not the usage of those services, right? A family of four in a $200,000 home or $400,000 home or $600,000 or $800,000 are going to have the same
schooling needs, police protection, et cetera. So what's the thought behind ability to pay versus use of services? Does seems to be out of kilt with that proposal.
And that's a good point. And there's a debate among public finance experts around the property tax on whether the tax is a tax on capital, which would be a tax on wealth, or whether it correlates with the benefits that are received. And frankly, nobody's been able to figure that out very well. The theory says it should be a tax on capital, that it is, I mean, in practice, that it should turn out to be a tax on capital, which would tend to reduce the price of the homes slightly, and therefore moderate any future price increases. But there's also the argument that says, no, it should be correlated with the benefits that are received. And my own view is that the portion of the tax that applies to land is a tax on capital. The portion of the tax that applies to the building should be correlated with the services that are received. But in this state, we have to tax both at the same rate. And so it's hard to make that distinction.
And yet land's normally 20% of the total purchase price, right?
25%, the way the assessors are doing it. But if we tax land differently, or at a different rate than we tax the buildings, then we could fine tune those kinds of things very, very easily, I think. Please.
So if you went back to when these were set up, these tax breaks, it was just, if you have a primary home, we're going to give you a break. Second, if you have an extra home, it's full value, which is also how we treat business.
Except we don't give you a break for the first one.
Well, right. Businesses are taxed at full value.
Right.
There's no breaks, period.
Correct.
So a long time ago, someone made the choice that we're going to kind of subsidize homeowners and not businesses, or give the homeowners a break. Now, the inclination is that if you have over a certain amount of money, that we're going to tax you because you're rich. And this is not just on property tax, but other things, you know. And the reason I brought this up is that we had a discussion, I don't know if it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, that had to do with cars, where you used to pay property tax based on the value of your car. And if you own an old car, you'd pay very, very little. But if you bought a new car, you paid a whole bunch. And somebody didn't like that. And as a matter of political expediency, they changed it so everyone kind of pays the same. I don't know what kind of politics are going to come to play with this discussion, but I just find it interesting. In that case, there was a move to not tax those that had the ability to buy the expensive cars because they just politically didn't want to.
Except for that we do get them to the sales tax. We charge sales tax on the
one time.
One time, right. And there is a legal history behind this and the politics behind this exemption as well. It did take a constitutional amendment to put it in place. The constitutional amendment sets the maximum of 45%. There was some legal wrangling going on at about the same time. There were some court cases filed by businesses saying, hey, we're being taxed more heavily than other property. That's not consistent with the Constitution. They prevailed in those cases, and so the state was faced with having to rework the way the property tax system worked in order to satisfy those legal requirements. And in doing so, it would have meant a very substantial increase in residential rates. To avoid that, they changed the assessment ratio. They gave them the 45% exemption. Actually, it was initially about a 22 or 23% exemption initially. Please.
Dr. Walters, one of the interesting facts that occurs in Utah is that we tend to stay in our single-family homes longer than people across the country on average do. In fact, in some cases, almost 3 times as long. The turnover of a typical single-family home happens much less frequently. It strikes me as a possibility of incentivizing turnover in those larger homes if you increase the property tax disparity between a less expensive home and a more expensive home. In other words, rather than retiring retiring and staying in your paid-off 6-bedroom home in a single-family subdivision, and now all of a sudden the schools are in the wrong places because the big homes that surrounded the old schools now are occupied by empty nesters. Could have a corollary benefit of suggesting, at least creating an incentive for those empty nesters to move out of their expensive 6-bedroom home into a smaller condo where the value would be significantly less, taxable value would be significantly less. So again, I don't know if we thought about that, but it would, there's benefit to our communities to encourage churn and regentrification in those single-family neighborhoods.
I would just say that I hadn't thought much about that, but as a father of 7, all of whom are grown and gone, I don't believe in an empty nester could.
I've had the same experience.
I have to check the beds in the morning to see if I'm an empty nester.
Yeah. I understand that very well as well.
But it might be bigger inside, but move smaller.
But again, this is simply to stimulate your thinking, and because I think I think you'll see this discussion pop up in other parts of the state as well in the months ahead, and it's worth your time and effort to give some thought as to what's fair and what's equitable in the way we run the property tax system. So, thank you.
So we have a few minutes. Love to hear a rundown on what the great things that are happening in Orem, besides the fact that we have an ocean rec, which we're very grateful for. But yeah, just I've noticed this. We're having the complex on State Street. That was, yeah, Midtown Village. It looks like that's near completion.
Yes, well, yes and no. So Midtown Village, the South Tower is 90% rented. They've changed from condos to apartments. We have businesses on the main floor. The North Tower is now renting or leasing, and it's moving right along. It's looking really good. They are going to build 2 towers to the west that are smaller, and they'll also build an amenity package. So when it's done, there'll be 500 apartments for rent, and like I said, the response has been very good. At the same time, at the mall, at the Aston Apartments, they have the first section that they've done. They have a very high lease rate. It's gone very well. And they're starting to lease out to new ones that are being built. So they're looking at like 440 apartments right now. So that's doing well. We have other apartment complexes up and down State Street. And surprisingly, they are doing well and leasing out. So we have a new one on Center Street over by the freeway. It's leasing out. The park on Center Street is doing well. We have 4 or 5 others, and they're all 40 to 60% leased out. So that's doing very well. The mall, we're going to have a groundbreaking October 3rd through the 8th of the Orchard Park, which they're putting in, which is about a 2-acre park. It's going to have a playground area, indoor, outdoor playground area. It will have a water feature. It will have a program director, have an outdoor theater. So it's going to be really beautiful when it's finished. We've been working hard on roads. In Center Street, we've rebuilt. We're redoing 1600 North and State Street, an intersection there. In our city, you might have seen a lot of construction crews on our roads. Those are actually not ours. Those belong to Canyon Construction, who is under contract to Questar or Dominion, and putting in high-pressure gas lines throughout the city. So our gas lines are about 70 years old. We've had a lot of discussion with our residents as to what is an old pipeline and what is a current pipeline, and it really relates to your soil conditions and how it's protected by cathodic protection. But 70 years, Questar feels like it's time to replace those. So they've gone through the whole city and replaced them. Interestingly, Canyon Construction has done a great job on the overlay on the asphalt, but in Linden, for whatever reason, the asphalt they put down did not meet spec, and they were forced to tear it out and relay the whole part of State Street going through Linden. So they have a spec they have to meet. They take samples, and if they don't meet that spec, then they have to go and redo it. And that costs them quite a bit of money there in Linden. We have a water line that we're working on. And we have other roads, 2000 North. We've been working on that and relaying part of that. So there's a lot going on there. We still are having about one ribbon cutting every week in Orem. We've been doing that for 2 years now. We just had a ribbon cutting this week on the new Mountain Land Head Start facility over by the Seville Senior Apartments. Looks very nice. So we have pardon me?
Playground.
Let me get to that in a second. And we have a ribbon cutting with WW Flag, which moved out of Springville and put in a new building on 800 North in Orem. So they have that building. Then they have their corporate headquarters just about 2 blocks south, and then they have Geneva Rock just south of there. So they're kind of focusing and concentrating in Orem. And again, that open house will be tomorrow. We have the Altogether Playground, which we're building. That is through donations, and both in money and in kind. It's coming along very well. We're going to be seeing everybody come together, United Way. Steve, I don't know if you want to mention all the people that are coming together on that.
I probably couldn't remember all of them, but Habitat for Humanity and United Way are kind of our partners in recruiting volunteers, but it's about 3,200 in a 7-day period.
Right.
Did you ever raise some good money for you?
Jimmer's raised some great money, and we had a belly flop contest this last week and raised some money there as well. And the mayor went off the board first in a suit, and so it's a pretty fun experience.
The belly flop?
Yes. So we're having a lot of fun with that. So, council, any other things you want to mention about what's going on in the city?
Do you want to mention the date of the build out? It's September 5th through the.
Yep.
We have the Storytelling Festival coming up here at the end of this month. And a lot of great things happening. So,
The dog park's kind of a.
sure, we have a new dog park. Yes.
Yeah, we're taking notes from you guys. Thank you for
Is there
leading
one
the
by the
way.
development by Costco?
No, we're actually no.
One, I saw.
Yeah, that's right, that is it.
We have the new dog park's going to be up the canyon by the Timpanogos Park, just on the backside. We are going to have a dedicated water supply for both small and large dogs. We'll have green grass. We'll have we have rocks along the outside, so we'll see how that goes, and rocks around the trees. And so we're excited. And the last thing is we have a splash pad coming into Cascade Park, or on Palisades Park, where Cascade Golf Course used to be. And that'll be coming in next year. And it's about a $750,000 project. It's going to be beautiful and stunning.
I did see in the news that you're discussing water storage. You're in the same boat as we are, trying to provide a little more storage. Are you building new tanks or replacing, or what? I didn't read the article, I just saw.
Trying to get additional, so we need better location in the pipeline access. So the cost is pretty high, and but the need is there. The other thing is we're doing this in conjunction with Vineyard, and Vineyard has a great need, as you can imagine, with their population going up tremendously. But yeah, infrastructure is a big part of what we're looking at.
And how are you balancing that with the growth? Are you to a point where you would hold off on development because you don't have the water, or are you just
right
trying?
Right now, we put in a water master plan, we put in a sewer master plan, we put in a stormwater master plan. So you might be familiar with the sewer master plan that we had a bunch of apartments who were paying 1 or 2 fees for the entire complex, or we had a housing HOA that had 48 homes, was paying 1 or 2 fees for the whole thing. So connection fees. So we've rectified that, and base fees, not connection fees. But our base fee is set now that for everybody who uses it has to pay, whether it's an apartment or a house. And I think makes it more fair for everybody involved. In our master plans, we've set them up as a pay-as-you-go on a 7-year program, and trying to keep up with the infrastructure needs. As we experienced and as you experienced, we went 5 to 6, 7 years without doing much at all during the downturn, and we have a lot of things that need to be done. So we've had a lot of discussions, a lot of public input, but we've moved ahead with it and passed it. So.
Recently done a similar thing with our sewer rates, charging by connection and by unit as opposed to, a single complex and stuff.
Yes.
So what's your philosophy with fees? Should people pay for the services they get? Or do you subsidize a lot of them?
Well, I believe they should pay for what they get. I don't know if we subsidize. Jenny, you want to address that?
Well, actually, we're in the process of evaluating and conducting an impact fee analysis. We do believe that there should be those who create the impact should bear not necessarily all the costs of future growth and development, but a fair share of those costs. Historically, we have absorbed a lot of that growth through existing user fees, and it really has taxed our system in a way where it's going to be a concern to us long term. And so we're looking at a little bit of a shift in philosophy to try and address the future growth and expansion, and honestly replacement of our infrastructure. So we anticipate that impact fees will be a topic of much conversation in the future.
We are one of the few cities who don't charge impact fees. So it's probably time that we move forward with that. Another thing to maybe make mention, we annexed in, as you're probably aware, 227 acres in the southwest section of our city, and the developer asked us if we would go ahead and put in the infrastructure to carry that out. We requested the reverse, so he actually paid the infrastructure, and through the use of impact fees, then we would pay him back. And I think that makes much more sense.
And he agreed?
He agreed.
Well, he didn't necessarily have a choice. Because we actually created a service area and adopted impact fees and provided him the opportunity to develop in that area with the acceptance of those fees.
I think, we have talked about transportation, there's a number of projects going on that impact both cities. We're waiting 3, 4, 5 weeks away, I think, from opening the West Side Connector. It's very close, it's about 95% done. That one's from the Home Depot out towards the airport. We're getting a lot of pressure to turn that plant, as you might imagine, around the high school to connect that road even further north, and they're trying to build sections of that. I believe that would be a great road for both cities, and eventually connect.
Eventually connect to 12 South.
Yeah, and actually that will go up through all these communities.
I think that's just critical for our cities, our transportation needs, and getting that west side connector finished is just a very important piece. And as it moves to the high school, it's going to facilitate that getting that a lot quicker. It's putting a lot of pressure on roads all around that high school area. And we're feeling a lot of development pressure, residential development pressure on the west side over there. And I couldn't be surprised if that impacts you as well. Over there, 2000 north.
And you mean traffic coming up Geneva Road and connecting to the freeway? How do you mean that?
I was thinking more specifically development pressure, residential development pressure coming out through there. A combination of high school, the scheduled service at the airport, and completion of this road are driving a lot of residential development out there that's been kind of sleepy for a long time. The road has a trail along the side of it, which we're very excited about, and obviously we'll intend to continue as it goes on. Orem. It will actually be a section of the trail around the lake. We talked this morning in the Utility Commission about the desire to get that trail all the way around the lake. It's pretty exciting for us. Downtown, there continues to be a lot of activity downtown. probably seen the big Wolf State Coast building. It's coming in, and the building now, the hotel is just to the east of that.
What is the hotel?
Hyatt Place, did I get that right one? Hyatt Place there, which we believe will help the convention center there as well. We're good for that.
And parking for the convention center?
You know, that's an interesting question. As downtown continues to grow, it morphs a little bit.
Because you're taking some out.
Yeah, from a sleepy downtown to being able to park wherever you want to the extreme of a big, city like Salt Lake where you just plan a parking garage and walk. So we are kind of in that transition period, and it puts a lot of pressure on some of the shops that always have parking spaces in front of their building.
Parking garage in the future, or don't know?
Nothing's planned. We have a number of garages right now that don't have any grease stains in
Okay.
top 2 levels. And so we've got to figure out if we can work over these. We're hoping we have new mall owners as well, and we're hoping to see some expected changes there, as well as the what's being called the mix. The Plumtree Plaza very close to you there. We expect some changes there as well.
And part of the reason that they're doing that is the mass transit, is that correct?
Well, that's a really important component to the development, as is the out of the mall. And I understand it is a mall as well.
Yes.
But the mix, as you've probably seen over years past, is very predictable. Put a grocery store in, and it comes out. And you put another grocery store in, and it comes out. And they're hoping to change the dynamic of that. We'll also be seeing some of the buildings probably coming down in the very near future. And I see Cameron here.
Yeah,
We
thank
always
you.
keep Cameron waiting.
That's right. We appreciate Cameron Deal and Ken Bullock from the Utah League of Cities and Towns have come down and are willing to share a few things with us. So thank you, Mr. Deal. We appreciate you.
Cameron's got a red and blue tie on, and I want you to know, if you know Cameron, this was quite a sacrifice to add some blue to that tie.
I had to try just to make sure he got here.
Yeah. Don't you fret, I'm wearing my University of Utah socks,
Oh, man.
which were actually a gift from Orem City. So it's a win all the way around here.
Orem's giving out socks now?
How's that happen?
Well, the Canadians have socks too, they just don't have a University of Utah logo on them. So thank you for the opportunity to come down, and I apologize that we're a few minutes late. We were addressing a very similar group in Salt Lake County at noon today. And there were not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 people during the public comment section right before us. It's the first time I've ever seen public comment at that meeting, and that's what delayed us from being able to present there and then get down here. When Bryce invited me, he asked me to address a couple of issues and then just take questions about other legislative priorities that we've been working on this summer. The top 2 issues were the issues of the gas tax and short-term rentals. Also wanted an update on some land use efforts, particularly with impact fees, and then a conversation potentially about the property tax exemption, and then whatever questions come from there. So how much time do I have?
About 15 minutes. Can you talk fast?
You better believe it. Okay. This way I can see a clock. On the gas tax, we've made significant progress today. This morning we met with the Association of Counties and Wasatch Front Regional Council. It's the 5th negotiation that we've had with them since the end of June. As a quick reminder, HB 60 passed last legislative session, and it modified House Bill 362 from the 2015 session. Our anticipation with House Bill 362 on the gas tax piece, separate from Prop 1 and the local option, was that every city, town, and county would see approximately a 17.5% increase from the motor fuel tax. HB 60 modified that revenue so that 12 hold harmless entities, 11 counties and 1 town, would see an increase of about 82%. Cities, towns, and non-hold harmless counties, including Utah County, would see an increase of between 8 and 9%. So we were alerted to this discrepancy and the disconnect between what we intended in House Bill 362 and then what happened in the modification bill in House Bill 60 by one of our cities in early June. At that point, we reached out to the Association of Counties, UDOT, legislators, and others to ascertain what the intent was of House Bill 60 and how it impacted House Bill 362. We presented, how many of you were able to see the webcast that we did in June? A few of you, okay, we did a webcast. You can watch that webcast on the league website where we explained the disconnect. And then we met with House and Senate leadership in July and Representative Johnny Anderson, who was the bill sponsor of both House Bill 362 and House Bill 60, attended. And they outlined a framework for us and urged local governments, cities and counties to come to consensus to get back to the original legislative intent of House Bill 362, which meant that HB 60 needed to be modified. So with that as the marching orders in early July, we've had 5 negotiations now with the counties, and we made a breakthrough last Monday and then continued that breakthrough this morning. There are 4 primary components to where we think we're going to be able to find consensus. First, cities, towns, counties would all still see that 17.5% increase from the 4.9 cent equivalent gas tax increase from House Bill 362. That was a line in the sand for us. That what 60 did was unacceptable. We needed to get back to that 17.5%. The concept that we presented to the counties last week, that they have since taken back to their members, addressed that 17.5%. They told us today that they were willing to continue considering that concept with the hopes that we could find consensus. They're meeting with their version of the Legislative Policy Committee in mid-September. So at that point, we'll know for sure if they're going to be able to support the concept that we put forward. First thing, 17.5% for everybody. Second issue is the value of the hold harmless. Prior to HB 362, the hold harmless had existed since 1997. And what the hold harmless was a collection of counties in one town that received a reallocation of BNC money from Provo, from Orem, from Pleasant Grove, from Utah County, and that reallocation bumped them up to match what they had received in 1997 before the formula had changed. So there had always been a hold harmless component in the law. What HB 60 did was it magnified it, and it locked in the hold harmless in perpetuity. That was unacceptable to us. So the concept that we've put forward would go back to the qualification language prior to House Bill 362. So if you qualified as hold harmless before 362, you could qualify today. However, because of House Bill 362, the gas tax went up approximately 5 cents, and that new revenue would mean that you'd have a lot of, you'd have 10 of the 12 counties and town who would naturally grow out of the hold harmless. So that was the concept that we presented today that they will take back to their members. What that would mean is that the hold harmless entities would phase out. And so instead of being locked in perpetuity like they are in HB 60, they would naturally phase out because they would see more money based on the 4.9 cent gas tax increase. The third piece is the growth component for those hold harmless entities. And those hold harmless entities, there would still be 2 left under the concept we presented. There would be 2 counties. And those 2 counties would still see a guarantee under the hold harmless. But the value of that guarantee would be in the $1.2 million range with an annual growth component. So it would be a smaller amount that's reallocated out of the B&C fund, which then frees up more money, big picture, for Provo, Orem, Utah County, and the non-hold harmless counties and cities and towns. And then the fourth piece is figuring out what we've termed the soft landing. So making sure that everybody, cities, towns, and counties would receive, at least in the first year, what they expected. So the counties had a higher expectation for the hold harmless counties than what we anticipated. Likewise, we had a greater expectation for what you would receive than what the counties did. So figuring out a way to try to get everybody, at least in the first year, to meet that expectation. And we were working through some of those figures today. So again, those negotiations were this morning. We wrapped those up. What time is it? About 2.5 hours ago. We'll be meeting again in the next couple of weeks. And the plan is to bring the full concept, language, numbers, and everything to our September conference. Hopefully, you're all planning to attend that conference September 14th through 16th, so we can put the details in front of you, get ratification for that direction. The counties will be doing the same thing the following week, and the hope is that if we can find consensus, that we can address this in a special session. Many of you know that the last distribution from fiscal year 16 is currently being held. UDOT, at request of legislative leadership in the governor's office, has not distributed that sixth distribution payment until cities and counties can come to consensus. This morning, UDOT attended the meeting. They're still trying to figure out exactly legally how long they can hold that money. Our intent is that that sixth distribution and fiscal year 17 going forward would be back to the 50-50 formula with this consensus on what the hold harmless framework would look like. Again, we'll have the details for you at the September conference, with the hope being we have consensus in September so that we can approach the governor's office and the legislature about a special session in October or November, so we can address it before the legislative session and at the beginning of your fiscal year 17. Questions? Okay, so that's the update. Feel free to call or email if you want to discuss that piece of it further. The second issue that I was asked to address was the issue of short-term rentals. Now, this is in shorthand your Airbnb or VRBO. And what we've started to see around the country, and it percolated during the legislative session here, is a conflict between local government and the short-term rental industry over regulation, enforcement, local control, local authority. This past legislative session, Representative John Notwell brought forward a proposal, and to his credit, he reached out to us at the beginning of the session, met with multiple municipal leaders, ultimately agreed to not push the bill with a guarantee and an assurance from the league that we would work on the issue during the off season and hope to find consensus without necessarily needing legislation. Over the course of the past few months, we have been analyzing all of these short-term rental ordinances or ordinances that may apply to short-term rentals unwittingly that exist in the state of Utah. To date, we've analyzed 63 of them, 56 cities and 7 counties. The analysis is still in draft form. But what I can tell you is that, for example, we found 7 different definitions of bed and breakfasts, 32 definitions of hotels, and 50 different definitions of motels. Now that shouldn't surprise anybody because Provo may define something slightly different than Orem and your neighbors, and you're very similar cities. Well, now if you're Provo, you're a very different city than, say, Springdale outside Zion Canyon, different needs, different populations, different impacts, and so the definition of motel might be different there. But we needed to understand the status quo of what was happening in our communities before we could really engage in a conversation with the industry and with legislators. Now that analysis is starting to wrap up, we've really started to narrow down the conversation about how we can still preserve our local authority over land use and our local authority and neighborhood responsibility at the city level, while also recognizing that the economy is changing and that people's demands are changing. I remember a comment that actually Mayor Curtis made testifying to the legislature a couple of years ago about towing, where he referenced the fact that somebody's vehicle, for many people, particularly in college towns like Orem and Provo, is the most expensive property that they own. Well, now magnify that for a house. And you have an issue where you have the property rights of homeowner A, property rights of homeowner B, and the way homeowner A uses his or her property may impact homeowner B. And homeowner B may purchase a house in a single-family neighborhood, expecting that this single-family neighborhood would have certain rights and certain responsibilities, but if that changes, and now the homeowner A can start to utilize his or her property in a way that negatively impacts the property value of B, now there's a conflict that percolates up to the city level, and you guys get to deal with it. What we've been adamant with Representative Notwell is we do not want to see statewide legislation that preempts local authority. We do not want statewide legislation like the type that passed in Arizona in May that would preempt municipal ability to regulate short-term rentals. There are places within cities where short-term rentals may make sense. You guys are better equipped to make that decision than the legislature is. There may be places where it may not make sense. You guys are better equipped to make that decision than the legislature is. He has recognized that there are significant impacts that come from short-term rentals, whether that be parking or noise or use of infrastructure. he's also asked us then to start considering within our zoning if there's a way to accommodate short-term rentals when it's an owner-occupied short-term rental. So for example, if Jamie was to rent out, while you're living in your home, rent out a portion of your home, and you're still there.
We don't care.
Oh, in that case, no, we don't. So their once was to rent out a portion of his home, and he was still living there, should or could that be allowed under certain types of zoning? And so we're starting to work through that process. We convened a working group in May consisting of cities and towns from Garden City to St. George, and we've been working with a software developer on code enforcement for short-term rentals, and we're going to have a workshop on short-term rentals with Representative Notwell in September. So that's the broad overview. I'm happy to take any questions of where we think it may be going from here, but fire away.
So you mentioned an owner-occupied home and renting out part of it. Now, if it's a normal situation in Provo, we have A overlay, we have accessory apartments, but that's not a business, even though they get a business license and they are making money, that's not a business where you're advertising and bringing people on a short-term basis.
Correct.
Which has a completely different impact on the neighborhood.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because I neglected to mention one of the other things we've been analyzing has been the business license piece and whether or not if you were to have a short-term rental, would you need to have a business license? Should you be treated as a commercial use instead of a residential use? If you're treated as a residential use and you get the property tax exemption, which you're actually now using your home for a commercial purpose, what happens there on the tax side? What about the collection and remittance of TRT, where the hotel, and I overheard the mayor as I walked in mention that there's going to be a Hyatt Place here in the downtown area. Well, that Hyatt Place has to play by a certain set of land use regulations and a certain set of tax regulations that an individual who lives in the Pioneer neighborhood who wants to rent out his or her home on a short-term basis doesn't have to play by those same rules. Well, is that fair? Essentially, government is now creating an unfair playing ground for different types of short-term lodging. And we've been in conversations with the hotel industry and the tax commission to talk through some of these obstacles and again, see if we can figure out resolution without needing state legislation. Our concern, frankly, is what happened in Arizona. In Arizona, the legislature passed a bill in May that preempted cities' ability to ban short-term rentals and prohibit short-term rentals, which was a priority of the governor there and a priority of legislative leadership. We've talked to our counterparts at the Arizona League of Cities, and they said the writing was on the wall, we knew this bill was coming, and they knew that not only did they lose locally, but they knew that their bill was going to become a template for other states. It was introduced in Hawaii shortly after. The nice thing is we have an excellent working relationship with Representative Notwell. He's been very receptive to our concerns about the impact on the community, particularly from your tourist homes, where somebody turns the whole house into essentially a hotel, and the impact that would have on a neighborhood, particularly if you're a neighborhood. You guys have magnificent mountains here, and a neighborhood tucked up in the foothills that overnight turns into a vacation destination. And you would be on the front lines getting the phone calls of people who are frustrated about the change in their neighborhoods. So he's been very receptive, has not opened a bill file yet. In fact, chatted with him this morning. We're going to be meeting with them next week in anticipation of the conference.
Can you just quickly go through Mayor Spieler's contribution with us?
Sure. So Ken mentioned Mayor John Spieler. He is the mayor of Garden City. He's also a web developer by profession. And in Garden City, has anybody spent much time up in Garden City? A handful of you? How many people do you think live in Garden City year round?
1,200 maybe?
Divide that by 2.
Okay.
Divide in half. So about 600 full-time residents. How many do you think they get on a weekend in the summer?
1,000.
Now, yeah, I'm no math whiz, so I can't tell you what the exponent is, but they get over 50,000 any given weekend in the summer. So the town is really focused on tourism, and so they actually developed a piece of software to help track and enforce both their local codes as well as track business licenses and try to create a partnership with the short-term lodging in the city. It's been very successful for them, and in fact, Mayor Spooler is part of our working group and has been working with Moab, St. George, Summit County, and a few other entities, Park City, about utilizing this software to make it easier to track compliance and enforcement with short-term rentals. Still doesn't answer the underlying question about local authority, but it does at least address some of the questions about enforcement.
So we have a variety of zones in Provo, more so than most places. I'm just wondering if it'd be, if they let us regulate it, could it be put into a particular place by zone?
Well, and frankly, our intent is to make sure you have the flexibility to make that determination in Provo. There may be zones where it's appropriate, there may be zones where it's not appropriate. Ultimately, our objective on every land use issue we work on, including this one, is to make sure you have that flexibility.
I just want to thank you for that. Thank you for that, pushing for local control on that. Right now, our ordinance prohibits short-term rentals. And I think that's really important for many of our neighborhoods. So appreciate that, you pushing for local control.
Well, and once the analysis is finished, we're happy to share our analysis of the Provo and Orem and any other entities within the area, so you can see our analysis, because what we heard during the session was that short-term rentals were banned statewide. But as we started digging, most of our ordinances that currently exist actually don't ban them statewide. And this gets to one of the issues that the Land Use Task Force is working on, which is the shorthand is the tie goes to the runner. If there's a conflict between a property rights owner and a city regulation, common law is that when there's that conflict, and it can reasonably be interpreted either way, the tie goes to the property owner. And what we found with a lot of the ordinances on short-term rentals is the way that they're currently drafted actually doesn't have the result that they're banned everywhere. They're actually allowed in most zones in the state because of the way the ordinances are drafted, which we don't have an opinion one way or the other on that. You should have the authority to determine, but what our intent is to put together a checklist of best practices, so that if in Provo and Orem you want to address short-term rentals, here are the best practices dealing with the hotel industry, here are the best practices on the land use side, here are the best practices on enforcement that then you could utilize to address the local needs that arise in your community.
If I may just add that what's important in this particular process is that we are working to help solve problems. The legislature is very much in a position with, they're part-time legislators and they have conflicts. And when you look at Sandy City as an example, you have a very strong experience with short-term rentals during the Olympics, and you have President Niederhauser, who happens to be a developer. Everyone knows that. And so they would like to see us draw our own solutions to this and see us solving it rather than bringing it to the legislature, because this is one of those issues that puts them in a no-win position. There's a recognition of property rights, but there's also a significant lobbying effort for your local zoning authority. So the more we can get current with our zoning ordinances and be consistent, the better off we'll be.
So with that, I passed the 1:30 mark. So I'm happy to stop. I'm happy to take questions. I defer to you.
Other questions on this item first? Okay. So the other word was an update on the impact fees, and you're going to talk. We did talk a bit about the property tax exemption already. So maybe if you could just touch on the proposed changes to impact fees.
Yep.
In a couple of minutes.
Okay, absolutely. So the league hosts the Land Use Task Force, and Land Use Task Force started 10 years ago to try to address complicated land use issues during the off-season rather than during the pressure cooker of the session. Last November, the league met with legislative leadership and some representatives from the Property Rights Coalition, and they outlined their priorities for the 2016 session. Well, that was November, and we said there was no way in good faith that we could work together to address those concerns from November until the 2016 session. But we committed to take a look during the 2016 off season, with the idea being that we could come to consensus legislation by 2017. And the two issues that came to the forefront were a rewrite of some provisions within the Land Use Development and Management Act and a rewrite to the impact fees code. both of those are Herculean tasks. Over the course of the last few months, we've had parallel tracks with drafting teams consisting of city attorneys and city managers and representatives of the Property Rights Coalition working on both of those issues. Ultimately, about 3 weeks ago, we collectively, property rights, local government, came to the conclusion that we didn't have the bandwidth to propel both forward. And so as of today, the impact fees effort is slowing down, and we don't anticipate, as of today, that it will result in legislation in 2017 and maybe more of a goal for 2018. As in the last meeting we had a couple of weeks ago, we dove into the details about redefining exactions, redefining impact fees. How can you spend impact fees? Is 6 years the right length of time? Should there be some sort of exchange in lieu of impact fees where you could get a one-time lump sum as a local government to spend on services and infrastructure, but it wouldn't have the same strings attached that the impact fees do? Really, we had a lengthy conversation and ultimately made that determination that there's too much to digest on top of the changes we're making on administrative review and legislative review of Land Use Development and Management Act. So I'm just going to stop there on the impact fee side, and I'm happy to provide additional detail of where the conversation has come, recognizing that it still has a long ways to go and probably won't be addressed in the 2017 session, subject to change.
May I make a point? Good to see how valuable Cameron is to the lake. And thank you for all that he does for us, and Cameron for being so on top of these issues and fighting a good fight for us. He's doing a great job.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to add one thing, and this is where a lot of this is going to be driven, is you more than any other county knows the impact of growth and the population surge that you're experiencing. Most cities do not have their land use ordinances current. And with the growth that is projected to come, the demand for housing, infrastructure, water, you name it, that's all demands on you as providers of that quality of life experience as well as the fundamental services. The pressure at the legislature is simply, I don't want to say simply, but there's an enormous amount of pressure for growth, jobs, everything that way. Yours, if you're not current, it makes all of those types of things that are coming that much more difficult to deal with. And so I would implore you to make sure that your ordinances, your land use ordinances are current. They're current with state statutes, because that's where the legislature looks. They're not looking at Orem and Provo and saying, okay, are their ordinances current? They're assuming that that's already done. And then we get caught crossways between the legislature, ourselves, as well as the development community. And more often than not, we look bad because we're not current. So for what that's worth, it can solve a lot of problems down the road if we're just staying current with state statutes.
So we had a presentation from Larry Walters about the property tax exemption. What is the league's position on this? Currently, it doesn't have a cap. It's just, your primary residence.
That's 45% regardless of the value of the property.
So what's your opinion?
Well, first of all, the league position is the position of the people in this room and 244 other cities and towns. And this is not an issue that's come before the Legislative Policy Committee in several years. It's been since the late 90s was the last time that this conversation really took place. So from a policy perspective and from a political perspective, I would say it would be a difficult task. You have a constitutional issue if you were to try to eliminate the 45% exemption. You have a political issue that Utah is one of the lowest property tax rates and property tax burdens in the country. And when this last was considered at the legislature, you actually had legislators that wanted to exempt the entire value of private property, residential. And from a local government perspective, that was troublesome because that would wipe out a huge chunk of the stool on which local government is funded. There's a constitutional concern, and then there's the statute piece. The statute piece says up to 45%, and the legislature's put it at 45%. There may be interest, I can think of a handful of legislators who may be interested in saying we need to ratchet that number back down. Originally, it was 25%, I think back in 1982. So it was up to 45% of what the Constitution allowed. Started at 25%, and the legislature twice has increased it to 45%. They may be interested if local government made a compelling case to ratchet that back down, but politically it'd be a very tough pill to swallow because you'd be raising or offering the opportunity to raise property taxes everywhere, which for the last 20 years, legislature hasn't been interested in that. Ken, you want to jump in, because you were here during the last time.
Suppose was to cap it like at 400,000, 200,000, 300,000, 400,000, not to, then they would take it down.
Yeah, what I was going to add, Mayor Stewart, is that I know Larry Walters and his colleague, Professor Gary Cornea, are involved with this, made some, I don't know if they've been contracted by a pro-education group that has some fairly prominent Utahns on, and I know that they made this presentation to them recently. And so you have a lot of different people looking at this. Is it first and foremost on our plate? No. Can it be? Yes. But you know, there are some other issues we've talked about that I think need to take precedence for it, but it's always there. Senator Stevenson and I talked yesterday. We've become quite good friends as we've discussed these issues, and he is not as anti-tax as people think. He just wants some accountability and he has a propensity to like certain types of taxes, and property taxes is something that he thinks is fair and equitable for everyone. So I think it's becoming not palpable, but it's a lot more on the table to look at and to evaluate than it's been in the past. A lot of, because of the reason we were just talking about, population growth that's coming, that you guys have experienced, and you've already gone through a lot of this, is going to be hitting them as much as it's going to be hitting you. So they need to look at all the tools that they have. I don't think it's off their radar. I think it's coming on, but what they do with it, that becomes a different issue.
And Bryce shared the information that was distributed to the Provo Council with us, so that we would have the report of some potential recommendations. And so we reviewed that report, and if it is a priority, then we welcome the conversation through the LPC and see where it comes up on the priority list. Last year, we tracked 261 bills at the legislature, and so there are a multitude of issues out there. So we respond to the issues where our members tell us these are the highest priority. If this becomes one of them, then we'll be there on the front line.
Well, thank you for taking the time to come down and share the vast knowledge that you have about all things.
More importantly, thanks for the invitation. It's always nice. We see Mayor Curtis and Wayne and Jamie on a regular basis, but all of you are always available I know you're available for us to call, but we also like coming down here. So thank you.
Yep, all jokes aside, happy to come to Utah County.
We'll invite you to a BYU game next.
I actually have not one, but 2 BYU game tickets on my fridge, because my wife's a BYU fan, and I was staring at them the other day, and I couldn't believe this was happening to me.
Great for your marriage. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to Orem City Council members. I appreciate this working relationship that we have with you. Taking the time today. I know we're a little bit over time, and so appreciate your patience there, trying to coordinate some schedules today, but it's been very beneficial, and we do look forward to this meeting. So thank you very much, and on that note, we look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Those in favor? I think that's unanimous.
Should I say everything?
Any